They told Mark his EV charger was a violation, slapped him with fines, and threatened more if he didn't remove it. The HOA president, Rachel Carter, smugly declared that his actions were against community standards, all while ignoring his rights as a homeowner. She even warned him that fighting back would be pointless. Rachel, confident in her unchecked power, thought she could silence him like so many others. What she didn't know was that Mark had a plan, one that would unravel her web of control and expose secrets she never wanted the world to see. By the time the truth came out, the entire neighborhood was watching, and the fallout was more dramatic than anyone could have predicted. But let's start at the beginning. Mark Reed had always been a quiet, driven individual. His modest suburban home sat at the end of a tidy cul-de-sac, surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and flowering trees. For Mark, this house wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of his commitment to a sustainable future. Recently, he had taken the next step in his journey toward eco-friendly living by installing an electric vehicle, EV, charging station on his property. It was a sleek, unobtrusive device, tucked neatly against the side of his driveway, blending effortlessly into the surroundings. At first, everything seemed fine. Mark admired the smooth efficiency of his new system and the pride of knowing he was contributing to a greener planet. But less than a week later, as he sipped his morning coffee and watched the sunlight filter through his kitchen window, an envelope with the distinctive HOA logo appeared in his mailbox. Its bold red lettering stood out like a warning beacon, and Mark's stomach sank before he even opened it. The letter was curt and to the point. The HOA, led by its notoriously strict president, Rachel Carter, deemed Mark's EV charger a violation of the community's aesthetic guidelines. He was ordered to remove it immediately or face escalating fines. The phrasing was sharp and unforgiving. Failure to comply will result in significant penalties. Mark felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The charger was on his property. How could this possibly be a problem? Determined to resolve the issue amicably, Mark attended the next HOA meeting. The room was packed, with Rachel Carter seated at the head of the table, her posture rigid and commanding. She wasted no time in addressing the issue. "Mark," she began with a condescending smile, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm for environmental causes, your charger disrupts the visual harmony of our community. It simply doesn't align with the standards we've worked so hard to maintain." Mark tried to reason with her. He explained that the charger was legal, environmentally friendly, and entirely within his property lines. But Rachel wasn't interested in compromise. Her tone turned icy as she delivered her ultimatum. "If it's not gone by the end of the week, you'll face the consequences." Walking home that evening, Mark's mind churned with frustration. How could something as beneficial as an EV charger be treated as a threat? It wasn't just about the fines, it was the principle. His charger represented progress and personal freedom, and he wasn't about to let arbitrary rules take that away. Mark sat at his dining table, the HOA letter resting in front of him like an unwelcome guest. The crisp paper felt heavier than it should, its words pressing down with an almost physical weight. Determined to make sense of the situation, he pulled out the HOA's bylaws, a thick document filled with tiny, impenetrable text. It was late, the quiet hum of his refrigerator the only sound, as he flipped through the pages, hoping to find the clause Rachel Carter had referenced. Hours passed, and Mark's frustration grew. The rules were vague, peppered with broad terms like community standards and aesthetic integrity. There was no mention of EV chargers, no guidelines, no restrictions. But then he stumbled upon a clause that made his stomach tighten. It granted the HOA board the authority to interpret minor property changes at their discretion. That single line was the gateway Rachel had exploited, twisting its meaning to fit her agenda. Mark closed the document and sighed. He had hoped for clarity, but instead, he was left with even more questions. Why was the HOA so determined to fight this? His EV charger was practical, legal, and environmentally conscious. It didn't disrupt anyone, and it certainly wasn't an eyesore. Frustration turned to determination. He wouldn't let arbitrary rules dictate what he could and couldn't do on his property. The next morning, Mark's resolve was tested again. Another letter arrived, this one more aggressive. It demanded immediate payment of a fine for unauthorized alterations to his property. The fine wasn't just steep, it was outrageous, an obvious attempt to bully him into compliance. Mark clenched the letter in his hand, the edges crumpling under his grip. It was clear that this wasn't about rules, it was about control. Feeling cornered, Mark decided to reach out to his neighbors. He knocked on doors, starting with the families he knew best. What he discovered shocked him. He wasn't the only one dealing with Rachel's overreach. One neighbor, an elderly man named Tom, shared how Rachel had forced him to repaint his house twice in the past year, claiming the shades of beige he'd chosen were too bold. Another neighbor, a young mother named Lisa, revealed that Rachel had demanded she remove her children's swing set because it clashed with the HOA's vision for the neighborhood. The stories kept coming, each one painting a picture of a community trapped under Rachel's iron grip. "She's been getting away with this for years," Tom said, shaking his head. "Most of us don't fight back because we don't have the time or energy. But maybe you can." His words lit a fire in Mark. This wasn't just about his charger anymore. It was about standing up to the unchecked power Rachel wielded. Mark knew he couldn't do it alone. That evening, he contacted a local attorney specializing in property rights. They met in a cozy office lined with law books, the faint scent of coffee in the air. The attorney listened intently as Mark recounted his experiences, nodding thoughtfully. "You've got a case," she said finally, "but it won't be easy. We'll need evidence, letters, emails, anything that shows a pattern of overreach." Mark returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the following days, he meticulously collected every piece of correspondence from the HOA. He recorded his conversations with Rachel, capturing her dismissive tone and veiled threats. He gathered testimonies from his neighbors, compiling a dossier that painted a damning portrait of Rachel's leadership. As Mark pieced everything together, he felt a mix of anger and hope. Anger at the way Rachel had used her position to intimidate and manipulate. Hope that his efforts could finally bring change. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was regaining control, not just of his property, but of the fight for fairness and accountability. Mark stood outside the courthouse, clutching the folder containing his complaint. The city square buzzed with the usual hum of daily life. But for Mark, this was a moment of transformation. Filing the lawsuit against the HOA wasn't just a legal step. It was a declaration that he wouldn't let Rachel Carter's overreach go unchecked. As he handed the documents to the court clerk, a strange mix of anxiety and resolve settled over him. This was the start of something much bigger than he had anticipated. Later that day, Mark visited City Hall to file a formal grievance against the HOA. Sitting in the quiet municipal office, surrounded by stacks of ordinances and regulations, he explained his situation to an attentive official. The response surprised him. "You're not the first to raise concerns about this HOA," the official said, flipping through a file. "But what you're describing, documents with inconsistencies, that's serious. We'll look into it." Days passed and the official's words proved true. Preliminary reviews revealed glaring contradictions in the HOA's documentation about community aesthetics. Some approvals lacked proper signatures, while others bore dates that didn't align with meeting minutes. The city opened a formal investigation, and the cracks in Rachel's fortress began to show. But Rachel wasn't going down without a fight. She launched a counteroffensive, using her position to sow doubt and resentment. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, accusing Mark of trying to undermine the community. "Do you want one person's selfish actions to destroy the harmony we've built together?" they read. Neighbors whispered about Mark at the mailbox, their glances filled with skepticism. The pressure was palpable, but it only steeled Mark's determination. Refusing to let Rachel control the narrative, Mark rallied the support of his allies. He organized a community meeting at Tom's house, where they set up folding chairs in the living room and passed around coffee. Mark laid out his case, presenting the letters, fines, and audio recordings he'd collected. The room was silent as they listened to a recording of Rachel casually admitting that some rules were designed to keep people in line. Her tone dripped with arrogance, and by the end, murmurs of anger filled the space. One neighbor, Lisa, spoke up. "I've dealt with her too. She's threatened me over the smallest things. This has to stop." The room erupted in agreement. Mark felt a swell of relief. For the first time, he wasn't alone in this fight. Word spread quickly, and soon the story caught the attention of a local reporter. When the article ran, complete with interviews from Mark and his neighbors, it painted a vivid picture of Rachel's overreach and the community's growing frustration. The headline was sharp, the kind that made readers pause. HOA president faces allegations of mismanagement and abuse of power. The article sparked a wave of interest. Calls came in from other communities, people sharing their own battles with overbearing HOAs. The story gained traction, eventually catching the attention of larger media outlets. Within days, Rachel's name was trending locally. Her image splashed across screens as the poster child for HOA corruption. Mark watched it all unfold with a sense of vindication. The tides were turning, and Rachel's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. But even as the spotlight shone on her misdeeds, Mark knew the battle wasn't over. The court date loomed, and the stakes were higher than ever. Still, for the first time in weeks, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as neighbors filed in, eager to witness the climax of a battle that had consumed their community for weeks. The air was heavy with tension, the polished wood of the benches gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, his attorney beside him, flipping through a meticulously organized stack of documents. Across the aisle, Rachel Carter sat stiffly, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Mark's attorney opened with a confident tone, laying out the facts with precision. She highlighted that Mark's EV charger was fully compliant with city regulations and positioned entirely within his property boundaries. "This case," she said, her voice ringing clear, "is not about community aesthetics. It's about abuse of power." As the evidence unfolded, it became clear that Mark's case was rock solid. Photos showed the charger tucked neatly along the edge of his driveway, barely visible from the street. The judge nodded thoughtfully as the attorney presented a map of Mark's property, marking the exact location of the charger to dispel any claims of encroachment. Then came the turning point. Mark's attorney introduced records obtained from the HOA's own files, revealing a troubling pattern. It was disclosed that Rachel had been pushing for the installation of pay-per-use charging stations in the neighborhood. These stations, it turned out, were owned by a company linked to her brother. Gasps rippled through the room as the attorney produced emails where Rachel discussed strategies to encourage compliance by eliminating private chargers like Mark's. The judge's brow furrowed, his disapproval unmistakable. Rachel's defense faltered under scrutiny. When called to testify, her arguments about community harmony seemed weak and self-serving. Her carefully crafted persona began to crack, exposing the calculated manipulation beneath. "We had to make decisions for the good of the neighborhood," she insisted, her voice faltering under the weight of the evidence. The final blow came when Mark's attorney played an audio recording, a conversation between Rachel and a board member, where she admitted in no uncertain terms that targeting Mark was part of a larger plan to push residents toward the pay-per-use stations. "If we don't enforce this now, people will think they can just do whatever they want," Rachel's voice echoed through the courtroom. The room fell into an uneasy hush. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. "This court finds that the HOA's demands were not only without legal basis but also motivated by personal gain," he announced, his tone firm. "The plaintiff's EV charger is lawful, and all penalties levied by the HOA are hereby nullified." He paused, then turned his attention to Rachel. Furthermore, the actions of the HOA president constitute a breach of fiduciary duty to the community. The court orders Ms. Carter to step down from her position immediately and pay damages to the plaintiff for emotional distress and legal fees. Relief washed over Mark as the words sank in. He glanced at his attorney, who gave him a reassuring nod. Across the aisle, Rachel sat motionless, her face pale as the reality of her downfall set in. The community's reaction was swift. Many who had once supported Rachel's vision now saw the truth. Neighbors approached Mark after the hearing, some offering apologies, others expressing admiration for his courage. The local news picked up the story, framing it as a victory for personal rights and accountability. As Mark stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This wasn't just his victory, it was a stand for fairness and transparency. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges, but Mark had proven that standing up for what's right could change everything. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. The battle was over, and justice had prevailed. The sun was just beginning to rise as Mark stepped outside, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. His EV charger stood proudly in its place, a quiet symbol of perseverance and justice. The court ruling had not only validated Mark's stance, but also set in motion a wave of change across the neighborhood. As he sipped his coffee, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. His battle wasn't just about one charger, it had become a turning point for the entire community. Rachel Carter's resignation had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The once intimidating figure, who had ruled with an iron fist, was now a symbol of overreach and misuse of power. Her attempts to retain influence fizzled out as more details of her actions came to light. People who had feared speaking up finally felt emboldened, sharing their own stories of unjust fines and arbitrary demands. The atmosphere in the community shifted. It was as if a weight had been lifted. Mark, however, wasn't content to stop there. He knew that real change required more than just removing one person from power. At the next HOA meeting, one that drew an unusually large crowd, Mark stood up to propose a comprehensive review of the association's rules. His voice was calm but firm as he outlined a plan to ensure transparency and fairness moving forward. "We need rules that serve the community, not control it," he said. His words met with nods of agreement and a smattering of applause. The new leadership embraced Mark's initiative, forming a committee to revise outdated policies. Neighbors who had once been wary of Mark now saw him as a leader, someone who had stood up for what was right even when it wasn't easy. Tom, the elderly neighbor who had been forced to repaint his house, approached Mark after the meeting. "You did something most of us couldn't," he said, shaking Mark's hand. "You reminded us that we have a voice." As weeks turned into months, the changes began to take shape. The revised rules emphasized clarity and fairness, stripping away vague language that had allowed for manipulation. Decisions were made collaboratively, with input from residents. The new board held open forums, inviting feedback and fostering a sense of trust that had long been absent. For Mark, the victory was personal, but also profoundly communal. Walking through the neighborhood, he noticed subtle but significant differences. Smiles replaced wary glances, and conversations once tinged with frustration now carried a sense of optimism. His neighbors, inspired by his stand, began taking a more active role in shaping their shared environment. On a quiet evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Mark reflected on how far things had come. His EV charger hummed softly in the background, a reminder of the battle that had sparked it all. He didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had refused to back down when faced with injustice. Yet, as he looked around at the transformed community, he couldn't deny the impact of his actions. Mark's story spread beyond the neighborhood, serving as an example for others dealing with similar challenges. Local news outlets highlighted his efforts, framing him as a champion of fairness and individual rights. "One person can make a difference," the headlines proclaimed, echoing the sentiment that had driven Mark from the start. As he sat back in his chair, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face, Mark felt something he hadn't in months: peace. He had fought for what he believed in, and in doing so, had helped not just himself, but an entire community. The system hadn't won this time. Truth and perseverance had prevailed, proving that even the smallest actions could spark meaningful change.